Well, the strong endorsement Chancellor Merz received in the Oval Office is in stark contrast with what we heard the President say about several other European leaders. Tonight, Donald Trump said he told his Treasury Secretary to cut all trade with Spain after the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, refused to allow the US to use its airbase in Spain for missions against Iran. The Trump administration is also at odds with one of its closest allies, the United Kingdom. The US President said tonight that he was not happy with the UK. And that's after the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, initially refused permission to use its airbase at Diego Garcia to attack Iran. Later, the Prime Minister allowed the bases to be used for what he called defensive purposes, but he clearly still had doubts.
This government does not believe in regime change from the skies. The lessons of history have taught us that it is important when we make decisions like this that we establish there is a lawful basis for what the United Kingdom is doing. That is one of the lessons from Iraq. And that there's a viable, thought-through plan with an objective that can be achieved or has a viable prospect of being achieved.
Let's explore some of these issues and more of these issues arising between Washington and Europe. Jeff Rathke is president of the German-American Institute in Washington. He's a former US diplomat with more than 2 decades of experience in European and transatlantic affairs, having previously served at NATO and at the US Embassy in Berlin. Welcome to DW. We heard President Trump say Germany's doing great over Iran. Why is he saying that when Germany's support has been so equivocal?
Well, I think the president was mostly drawing a contrast to the countries he was looking to berate during this Oval Office interlude. It's true that Germany has not stood in the way, in the way that Spain has, for example, but it's also pretty clear that the United States is not looking for major material contributions from its European allies in this war against Iran.
That's really interesting that you say that, because I think we've seen this pattern before, where the Americans lead others into an adventure, into a foreign adventure. The whole thing goes wrong. There's no thought-out plan. Then afterwards, there is talk of allies and others coming together and raising money for the reconstruction. Can you see that happening? Can you see America turning to its allies and saying, well, yeah, I know we didn't involve you, we didn't consult you, but now here is the thing that needs rebuilding. Get your checkbooks out.
Well, it's a possibility, I guess, but I think we're a long way away from that. I think one of the most striking things about the question and answer period in the Oval Office today was Trump acknowledging that the United States really doesn't have much of a plan for what comes next. And I think you saw in that respect Friedrich Merz coming back multiple times to this concern Germany has about the day after. And Trump admitted that even the sort of people who might take over in Iran have mostly been killed in the attacks. And so he was unable to specify where things go from here. And I think that's certainly got to be troubling for countries like Germany and America's European allies, who in normal circumstances would probably want to be part of a solution and putting this back on a more even keel. But it's unclear where this trip is taking us.
You see, that's really interesting because, again, we heard the German Chancellor say, yeah, we need to talk about what happens the day after. But this is an administration that I just wonder if that we is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. I wonder if the German Chancellor is actually kidding himself when he says that we will talk about it, because the words might be exchanged, but the United States will decide.
Well, I don't think the Chancellor has an inflated view of his ability to shape how Donald Trump approaches the war that he and the Israeli government are carrying out in Iran right now. I think what the Chancellor most likely wants to understand is what the United States' intentions are and then to be able to understand how that might affect German or European interests. We are not in one of those earlier conflicts, as you already mentioned, where the United States is asking its allies to be involved on the ground or in some major way in reconstruction. That doesn't seem to be the way the United States is going about this. In fact, the United States is really asking very little of its closest allies right now.
And what do you make of that? People have been comparing this attack on Iran to previous Gulf wars. But what we have here is no attempt by the United States to try and form any sort of wider coalition beyond Israel. So what does that tell us?
Well, I think that tells us, on the one hand, that the United States believes that this war will be manageable within the resources the United States has. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is the United States does not want to be constrained by the expectations or requirements of its allies in how it conducts a war. We heard just yesterday the U.S. Secretary of Defense disparagingly talking about rules of engagement. And so I don't think President Trump is interested in having European allies' conceptions of the rule of law and of international humanitarian law and the laws of war intrude onto his approach to Iran in this particular case. And so I think it's in some ways perhaps a comfortable position. President Trump can talk to Chancellor Merz, but he's not asking the Chancellor for anything specific. And at the same time, the Chancellor is not being dragged into the conflict in the way that previous U.S. administrations have tried to involve their European allies in various military actions and indeed wars.
OK, so we have the Chancellor Merz arguing, and indeed the French president arguing, lots of people arguing that Europe has to become more strategically independent from Washington. Does this latest war in the Middle East, does that strengthen that case or just expose Europe's continued dependence on the US?
Well, I think it highlights the dependence, because one of the other questions that hangs in the background during this war is that the United States is expending a large amount of its munitions in carrying out the strikes and also in intercepting and the air defense and missile defense mission. So the European allies have been dependent on the ability to purchase supplies from the United States in order to donate them to Ukraine. One can only ask questions at this point. We don't have definite figures, but the ability of the United States to continue providing those kinds of munitions to Ukraine via European buyers will rise the longer the American war in Iran continues. Right. And so that presents in very stark relief the problem that Europeans have of their weapons dependency on the United States and the need to ramp up their own industrial capacity in order to be able to dedicate it to priorities that European leaders set for themselves.
Right. So on that, European leaders clearly got the message from the US. They are no longer a strategic priority. Everybody agrees that they have to become more independent. Are you even close to being certain that a clear, coherent policy on strategic independence from the US will ever emerge, never mind actually being executed?
Well, It's not going to emerge in the sense that a single European statesman or stateswoman is going to lay it out neatly and tidily in a speech that everyone will recognize, nod their heads, and say, okay, now we have a vision of strategic autonomy or of independence or whatever label you want to put on it. I think because it will have to emerge from among European countries that are much closer to being peers than
Right.
the United States is toward European allies. This will have to arise through a process of negotiation and coalition building
Right.
rather than through someone laying down the law the way American presidents have often felt able to do toward Europe.
It's going to need to be a messy compromise. Thanks so much for talking us through that so clearly, Jeff. Jeff Rathke from the American-German Institute.
Thanks for the invitation.
Well, let's see what the German Chancellor may or may not have achieved with this visit with Tyson Barker. Tyson's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Berlin. Welcome back to DW, Tyson. So the Chancellor and the President do seem to have got on well again. Is that as much as the Chancellor Merz could hope for?
Well, this was a press camera spray before the substantive meeting. So obviously you want to go into that meeting having done no harm. And to the extent that the optics were right for the chancellor, I think that was successful. That said, he has a couple of offensive interests that are being crowded out by the war in Iran, specifically around keeping the United States on side as regards Ukraine. And there's some, unsettling words from President Trump on that front. And then the second is, of course, making some advancements on trade issues, trying to get some stability and guardrails in place for the trade relationship. And that's still an open question as to how that will look.
OK, we'll get to those, hopefully. Let's start, though, with Iran. Friedrich Merz has said that Germany and the US are on the same page in ending what he called the terrible Iranian regime. Yet Berlin has ruled out taking part in this attack. And the Chancellor said today that we have to look at the strategy that follows the fall of the Iranian regime. I wonder, is that wishful thinking? Is Germany likely to be in that particular loop?
I don't even know if the United States is going to be in that loop, to be quite frank. It doesn't seem that the administration has messaged that they are going to take a role in what comes next. Obviously, they've taken a decapitation offensive with the Israelis, but I think that they're quite satisfied with the operation as it played out in Venezuela, where you remove the top layer of leadership and then kind of see where the chips fall where they may, as much as they are preserving, an intact structure. I think that if you looked at the body language of President Trump when Merz mentioned that a couple of times, it wasn't as positive as in other points of the conversation.
Why do you think the Chancellor is being so equivocal about supporting the US and Israel? Is it all about not wanting to upset Donald Trump?
I don't think that Germany currently sees any. It doesn't advance Germany's national interest or European interests to be critical of this illegal operation, this unilateral operation. And to that extent, they are taking an approach of keeping the waters calm and trying to advance in a more iterative way on the areas of top interest. I mean, it's not like any kind of criticism of not taking this to the UN or, working this through a congressional process or a coalition of allies would have had a difference.
Let's talk about trade. Of course, this meeting was set up long before the US and Israel attacked Iran. Then tariffs would have been one of the big headaches that the Chancellor came to Washington to discuss. We know now the US Supreme Court has struck down many of President Trump's tariffs against individual countries, though they have allowed him to keep those tariffs on products like steel, aluminium, copper. The president has since said he's going to replace the struck down tariffs with 10% tariffs using different powers. Is the German Chancellor likely to get any good news on trade and tariffs from this meeting?
I think the Chancellor's greatest interest would be to get a better deal than the one that was negotiated in Scotland last year. But even that deal gave German industry, the German private sector, which its largest trading partner is the United States, some certainty and long-term planning capability regarding the United States. Now there's a ton of uncertainty. So President Trump called on Scott Bessent, called on his trade advisor, said, we've put in emergency tariffs in place currently that will last for 5 months, and we're already looking for ways to reconstitute these tariffs under other authorities. So I think that will be something that the administration is looking to do. Chancellor Merz came to this saying, I'm speaking with a joint position for the EU. So it will be interesting to see if he's able to advance that and to say, look, if you are able to give us a more favorable deal, then we can take action in the United States to invest more in the United States, to balance our trade relationship, et cetera. But obviously, as you heard in the room, everybody's mind is focused on Iran right now. So this issue is really kind of crowded out.
Right. And as we talk about Ukraine, you mentioned before that one of Chancellor Merz's hopes is that he can get Donald Trump to focus on that so that Ukraine doesn't get crowded out politically. But I wonder if Iran now presents a bigger problem, because does the US have the manufacturing capacity to keep producing and selling arms to Europe to give to Ukraine and to keep up its war in Iran? Does the fact that it is now involved in a hot war elsewhere, does that compromise its logistical ability to help Ukraine?
Well, President Trump spoke about this explicitly. He basically used some arguments that the Pentagon used in the summer and said, if we're stretched thin, then Ukraine is not a priority. And what he said in his remarks, he kind of resented the fact that the Biden administration had gifted Ukraine munitions to support its defense, and said that the Europeans had taken steps that are better because they're now purchasing munitions. But obviously, if that's not seen as a national security priority for the United States, that could be problematic. And he also mentioned, we have a lot of allies in the Middle East that are rich and can buy this equipment. So it's munitions, it's obviously air defense and other areas. And those that are Ukraine skeptics in the administration are going to use this as a moment to rebalance that use of kit.
Quick word then on German domestic politics. Germany has 5 state elections this year. The right-wing AfD is gaining ground. The AfD has been courting MAGA circles supported by Trump loyalists, Elon Musk and J.D. Vance and all the rest of them. Regardless of how well Chancellor Merz and the president got on, the Chancellor must be worried that Donald Trump might rather see the far right wingers in control in Germany rather than his own centre-right conservatives.
Well, he has a couple more years in power. This government will run until at least 2029 if the coalition doesn't collapse. But I think that the far right here, just like MAGA in the United States, is confused and frustrated with this war of aggression. This is not, in the U.S. domestic context, America first. It's not MAGA. It's not investing in domestic priorities. And I think that it's kind of knocked the AfD also for a loop, because they tend to be more critical of Israel, and they can also be critical of overseas adventures.
Good talking to you, Tyson. Thanks for talking us through that so clearly. Tyson Barker from the Atlantic Council.
Thank you.